Hello everyone, my name is Ann Cleveland and I am a paralegal at Lyles Parker. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Texas Association for Home Care and Hospice. Today's webinar is entitled Violence in Home Care, Protecting Your Patient and Staff. Today's presenters are Richard Pecore and Les Johnson. Les Johnson is a partner at Lyles Parker and is the supervising attorney for the firm's Baton Rouge office with over 17 years of experience. Core areas of Les's practice include handling Medicare and Medicaid appeals, Medicare and Medicaid participation, and compliance. Richard B. Pecore is a licensed Texas attorney with over 30 years of experience in personal injury and healthcare law. Mr. Pecore joined Lyles Parker as an associate attorney in January 2012. Mr. Pecore's practice focuses on Medicare and Medicaid administrative provider appeals and regulatory compliance plans for providers. Mr. Pecore is a certified medical compliance officer, a CMCL, and a member of the American Health Lawyers Association. Mr. Pecore's office is located in North Houston, Kingwood, Texas, and regularly visits clients in the Rio Grande Valley area. Now, without further ado, I present your speakers, Richard Pecore and Les Johnson.
Thank you, Ann. I appreciate TAC having us here today. We're going to talk a little bit about what you can do with your home health agencies to protect your folks. And Les has joined me graciously. If I happen to cough, I apologize because I'm still getting over COVID. So let's get started. Let's go to the next slide, Ann. Standard disclaimer, this is for educational purposes only. If you've got a situation, you need to consult an attorney, not look at a webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, first, what is workplace violence? OSHA describes workplace violence as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. It can affect workers, clients, customers, or visitors, basically anybody who's there. What's a workplace? Well, a workplace can be any location where you have employees. That's going to include your office building and attendant areas like parking lots, travel to and from work, and in the case of home health workers, patients' home. Examples of violence would be verbal threats to inflict bodily harm, whether that's overt, covert, or just vaguely veiled. Aggressive physical acts like striking or pushing, verbal harassment. Could be offensive language, gestures. We've all been exposed to road rage. Disorderly conduct, shouting, throwing things, punching walls, slamming doors, things like that. Everybody knows what violence is. It's what do you do about it? Next slide. The four OSHA identified high-risk areas are correctional facilities, healthcare and social service workers, late-night retail establishments, and taxi drivers. That's pretty much common sense. January 2017, they began inspections and issuing citations related to high-risk industries that have workplace violence. And in May 22, the National Nurses United website reported that a national survey of over 2,500 hospital nurses found that 48% of RNs had had some incidents of workplace violence since 2021, and there's the link if you want to look at it. Next slide, please, Ann. So how prevalent is workplace violence in a healthcare setting? The prevalence of workplace violence in healthcare. Well, on July 21st, 22, the Department of Justice, National Center for Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics released a new report entitled Indicators of Workplace Violence that looked at the reporting period of 1992 to 2019. So this just came out a few months ago. They found a total of over almost 18,000 workers were victims of workplace violence between that period of time, 1992 to 2019. But they also found that homicides had fallen more than 50% since 1994. So that's good news. The bad news is incidents of non-fatal violence have increased, especially with COVID. Next slide, please, Ann. So, according to OSHA, from 2002 to 2013, violence against healthcare workers accounted for as many injuries as all other industries combined, and that's 4 times greater than the U.S. average. These figures underestimate overall workplace violence, since only assaults resulting in time away from work are reported. The number of assaults is considered greatly underreported because of fear of retaliation, unintentional assaults, persistent perception that workplace violence is part of the job, and fear of reporting it'll reflect poorly on the worker. The actual violence, they estimate, could be underreported by as much as 70%. Next slide, please. So a CDC report found workplace violence nearly doubled for nurses and nurse assistants between 2012 and 2014. It's just a 2-year period. Nurses experience more non-fatal incidents of workplace violence than against the police or correction officers. And according to the New England Journal of Medicine, between 2000 and 2011, there were 154 shootings with injury either inside or on the grounds of American hospitals. Remember, we're talking about non-fatal at this point. Homicide's the leading cause of death in the workplace for nurses and employees in personal care facilities. The good news is we've already seen from a previous slide that the homicides have dropped dramatically. Next slide, please. According to the U.S. U.S. Department of Labor statistics, the last 2 years, healthcare workers accounted for 73% of all non-fatal workplace injuries and illnesses due to violence in the U.S. That were prior to 2019. This came out of the new report. COVID-19, as I mentioned, has increased these incidents, so we're seeing what I would regard as an artificial spike. Nevertheless, the rate is still high. Previous rate in 2013, 67%, as you can see down lower, of workplace violence injuries were in all industries were among healthcare workers. Verbal abuse, physical abuse, threats, stalking from patients, family members, or friends of family are forms of workplace violence. These are things that a healthcare worker knows about. It's things that y'all face. No one has to tell you that it's out there. You're well aware of it. You have to deal with it every day. Nearly 2 million American workers have been victims of workplace violence in the average year. And of more than the 9,200 workplace violence injuries that occurred in 2013, 700 were suffered by workers in home health care services. That does not include 430 animal and insect bites or attacks that they suffered. You go in, you see everything from a hostile dog to spiders or centipedes or something like that. Next slide, please. Did we skip a slide? We're on time. Okay, this is a, pardon me, a table from the new report that came out. We had some statistics in a similar presentation that was a few years old. We've gotten new statistics since then. As you can see, the 2019, which is the most recent, healthcare, the incidence rate and number of non-fatal occupational injuries and illnesses with days away from work resulted in workplace violence by occupation. We're talking about over 10,000 incidents in the healthcare support area. And what interests me about that is if you go back and you look at some of these other rates, these are increased from what they were previously because they were talking about 7,500 and 9,500. So there has been an increase. But look at the rate compared to law enforcement workers. It's about double. And that's both on the days away from work and the number of incidents. And the statistics are down there. There's a link if you want to look at the entire report. Got that link down there for you. Next slide, please. And here's where we get a little more in depth. The incidence rate and number of non-fatal occupational injuries and illnesses from days away from work, pardon me, resulting from workplace violence by victim characteristics and length of service of the victim. So you can see that the rate of workplace violence incidents are reflecting the home and healthcare worker industry, because twice as many women get attacked as men. We have, as the age range progresses between 20 and 24 and 20 and 25 to 34, that rate almost triples as far as your chances of experiencing an attack or incident. And then between the folks that are 35 to 44, the rate is still twice what it was when you were in your 20s. But the number of incidents is down, and I think that's probably due to the wisdom that you gain after you've been on the job for a while. You learn to recognize this stuff. You learn to get out of those situations or de-escalate them. So the knowledge and experience you gain over time does help you, but it's still a lot of incidents. And then it's keyed also to length of service. You see down there, if you've got less than 3 months on the job, rate of incidence is over 3,000. 3 to 11 months on the job, it doubles. And then it doubles again between the 1 to 5 year period. Now, granted, the time periods early on are just a matter of months, and you talk about a 4-year period that it takes to double during that length of time. But it shows you that the longer you're around, the more likely you are to run into a situation like this. If you're in the home health industry or if you're in hospice, this is what happens. It's part of the job, unfortunately. And again, there's the link for the report where this came from. And let's go to the next slide here. So we're going to talk about a survey we've talked about before. This was the Texas Nurses Survey, Workplace Violence Against Texas Nurses Survey. That was done back in 2016. December is when the results were released. They wanted to do a study of nurses in hospitals, freestanding emergency medical care facilities, nursing facilities, and home health agencies, and see what the incidence was. This is actually required by the Texas Health and Safety Code. One part of the survey wanted administrators to participate in the 22-question survey, and that had to do with practices and strategies that they used as far as training to help prevent workplace violence against nurses, to make them aware of what could happen, what they could do to help avoid or de-escalate situations. The questions had to do with the second part of the survey had the nurses and LVNs participate. There were over 7,500 of them, and they had a 20-question survey. They asked how frequently they experienced workplace violence over the past year, information on the most recent event that they had experienced, and how they rated their current employer in terms of their effectiveness in managing and preventing the violence. Next slide, please. Of the over 1,100 nurses who participated, including 130 home health nurses and 961 nursing facilities and 171 HHAs, the survey asked about prevalence and frequency of workplace violence. The HHA nurses, home health nurses, were less likely to have experienced an incident of workplace violence. 28% said they never had. They were less likely to experience an incident of physical violence. Only 6% said they had. And they were more likely to have experienced an incident of sexual harassment. The response rate there was 10%. Now that's as compared to their peers in the hospital industry or nursing facilities. Next slide, please. So who commits workplace violence? Well, we know that you can have violence by patients and their families. You can have an unhappy family member that's just as unreasonable as the patient. You could have violence by family members or friends of the family or friends of employees or staff. You could have violence by a complete stranger, either on the way to the appointment or on the way to your car, or someone who breaks into the home. There's just ample opportunity for this to happen because you're walking into a situation where either it's the first time you've met these folks or they could have family members in town. Next slide, please. So they did a profile study of a perpetrator, someone who's likely to commit violence, either the fatal or non-fatal variety. You would look at probable employees with a history of conflict or threats against their supervisors, coworkers, or their employer in general. It's frequently a white male between 30 to 40 years. Middle age could be a function of midlife crisis. They have a history of violent behavior generally. They exhibit paranoid behavior. Frequently responds negatively to criticism. They don't have very good coping mechanisms. There could be signs of possible substance abuse. They're frequently obsessed with guns or firearms. They'll take an excessive interest in media reports of, especially of job-related violence. They'll regularly or frequently complain on the job. They'll complain about poor working conditions, co-workers, and satisfactory working environment. They're just a complainer. They may have an unstable family life, and frequently they're loners. Next slide, please, Ann. So hearkening back to the Workplace Violence Against Texas Nurses survey from 2016, they found the groups who committed the types of violence over the previous 12 months against home health nurses were most often the patients. And family members or friends were also more often than other groups for each type of violence except for physical violence. So you're more likely to catch verbal abuse or some other form of violence in the form of gestures or whatnot from family members or friends, whereas the patients are more likely to commit some sort of physical act, which makes sense because you're having physical contact with these people out of necessity. Next slide, please. So what factors are involved? If we're talking about the patient and the home setting, what are some of the risk factors? You have patients that can have a history of mental illness, a history of violence, drug abuse, and or alcohol abuse. You're frequently working alone in the patient's home or the facility, so you don't have any help readily available. That's why you always have your cell phone with you. You always make sure it's charged. Poor emergency communications within the homes. Frequently, they either don't have a phone, they haven't paid the bill, it's not working properly, whatever. That's why you need your own communications. Frequently, they have weapons, and you may or may not know where they are. They may not have them stored properly, so that's a potential risk. And frequently, you're in a neighborhood area that either has a high crime rate or is run down because of the financial conditions. And you have to be aware of that, especially when you're transiting to and from your car. As far as the healthcare agency risk factors, you could have a situation where you have a lack of agency employee policies and staff training on how to recognize and manage an escalating hostile situation or recognize assaultive behaviors from patients, visitors, or staff. Getting training on the warning signs is pretty important. You could have poor security staffing or a lack of it. You could have a lack or absence of restrictions on unauthorized access to the agency offices. And that could be in the form of signage or electronic or physical barriers. But again, what you don't want is to have patients or family members wandering about the offices or getting easy access to it. And you could have no notice to staff, patients' families, or others that violence will not be tolerated and will be reported to the police. They have to know that that's not a situation that's going to be allowed. Either you have in-house security or you're going to contact the police immediately if something like that happens. My partner Les is here, and I'm going to let him roll forward with the next section. Les, would you be so kind as to take over, please, sir?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Les, and I guess I'm going to start with basically some examples of the kinds of cases that pop up involving workplace violence, both against the employees and patients, some tips for how to deal with it, some of the changes in law, and some of the things you need to have in your policies. So starting off, we've got a Integra case, which was a Florida home health caseworker aide who documented that she was very uncomfortable at home and was stabbed to death by her patient. The patient had served time for aggravated assault, and police received 50 to 60 calls about him in the prior 6 years. OSHA, they had a bunch of different findings in here. I find something, one thing significant is, and something for y'all to pay attention to, is that they looked beyond the individual case, the stabbing, and they looked at all of the incidents that have occurred in that agency. So they found that the employer knew that this particular patient had a history of violence, criminal behavior, and schizophrenia, so this is a mental health situation. But they took no steps to protect the employee. They found, and this is where they're looking outside of the incident at issue, they found multiple incidents where Integra employees were victims of verbal and physical threats from clients, and concluded that they didn't conduct any hazard assessments for those positions, caseworkers, service coordinators, and they didn't develop a plan to prevent workplace violence hazards. So they issued 2 citations, one of them with penalties. The penalties actually weren't all that horrible, but you know, the OSHA fine is at the end of the dispute, so you can still get sued. But they issued 2 citations with full penalties in March 2013 for failing to protect employees from violence in the workplace and for not reporting the death. They found that their approach to safety was inadequate, and they should have taken more precautions to prevent injury by hiring and training its employees appropriately. So this is basically, you know, not taking into account the individual patient's history of violence, and not really doing anything about violence in general. So it's just a lack of policies, lack of training. That's kind of where they got caught. Go to the next slide. So this is the Epic Health Services case, and it involved much larger fine, $98,000, and it was a sexual assault. So they opened an investigation after an employee was sexually assaulted by a home care client after the company had been warned by other employees of sexual assaults. It had numerous reports of verbal, physical, and sexual assaults on its employees. Note, not all by this same patient. So this is another situation where they looked outside of the incident at issue and just looked at their ongoing compliance and how they generally respond to these things, in addition to how they responded to the particular patient. They received numerous reports of physical, so they cited the company for 1 violation related to employee exposure for workplace violence, including physical and sexual assault, and also for failing to properly record injuries on those forms. So both companies, both of these cases, they had a problem with the individual client. You know, arguably they shouldn't have taken the first client, and the second one, they should have done something about it once they had warnings about this patient. But in general, you know, a lot of what their findings was, and I guarantee you that a big chunk of the $98,000 is for just how they responded to these kinds of things on an ongoing basis. So, not just how they recorded this injury, but how they recorded other ones in the past and how they responded to those. So you don't look at prevention of workplace violence as just how do we respond to this one incident and how do we do a, say, root cause analysis and prevent it. You need to have documentation that you're doing this all along. All right, so let's go to the next one. Next slide. So here are two examples where the patient was the one that got subjected to workplace violence. So in Oklahoma in 2017, there was a home health aide who was charged with murder after hitting the patient 30 times with an open fist, squeezing their head and smacking them with a bag. Nursing homes deal with the same kind of thing a lot. Sometimes there'll be a, maybe a mental health patient, maybe just a difficult patient, and they'll get frustrated and attack. Problem is, these are frail people, and sometimes they die if they attack. You cannot, one can attack a patient. You can't allow your employees to, even if they're attacked. I mean, you're not dealing with an even scenario here. Lots of times you've got an elderly person or someone who's frail on one side, and you just have to. It doesn't matter if your patient hits your employee; they can't hit back. Basically, I don't think that's what happened here. But just as an example, in our nursing home, we're constantly training people on how to just leave a situation so they don't get angry and they don't lash out. Because sometimes patients are really, really difficult. Sometimes they're just straight up violent. And not just the agency, but all the employees are there to protect the patients, essentially. So protecting and looking out for signs of abusive employees is just as important as protecting your employees from abusive patients. Texas had a interesting situation with a home health aide who smothered one elderly woman and attempted to kill two others. That made them start thinking about, whether or not they had an actual serial killer on their hands. Richard, you're from Texas. Do you know if they ever found any other cases related to this one at all?
I didn't have an opportunity to follow up on that, but that's a real interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, these kinds of things. The serial killers, there's a recent, I think it was in Texas too, when an anesthesiologist or someone was putting drugs into IV bags or something. I saw it on the news. That's more of a thing that you would pick up through your quality assurance kind of reviews and peer review process, but you never know, right? So when you see something fishy and you get I guess shady or you're skeptical of the excuse or the explanation you receive from your employee, don't just let it slide forever. I mean, you got to continually watch everything. But if you do track all complaints and incidents, patterns will be apparent, and it'll be much easier to spot at least. I won't say they'll always be apparent, but if you are tracking all these things, you'll notice which employee has a lot of complaints against them, and that's probably the ones you want to look at and or get rid of. You can't have people get harming the patients, and you just never know how people are when they're and they're not being supervised. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NOSHI, has a bunch of tips for how to manage potential or actual violence situations, and they include consider working with an escort. I'm sure most of these things y'all do. Work with an escort in high crime areas, and if possible, schedule visits during daylight hours. I would say that was probably critical, but I know lots of times there's just no way around that, especially in the fall. It seems to get dark at about 3 p.m. these days, or in the winter. So know the location and accurate directions to your patient's home. Obviously, you don't want to be walking around a bunch of different streets trying to find them. Try to inform coworkers your location and when to expect you to report back. I think there's some apps too that some people use for that kind of tracking employees that don't collect PHI or anything like that. They just track the location of the employees. If driving alone, keep your windows rolled up and locked and your doors locked. Park your vehicle in well-lit areas away from large streets or shrubs. Keep healthcare equipment, supplies, and personal belongings locked in your trunk, obviously so you just don't get broken into. Before getting out of your car, check your surroundings. It's really easy. Don't. There's more tips on the next slide. Let's go ahead. And so I think this one's kind of important. You know, if you're in a safe environment and you feel like outside is not safe, you know, finish anything you can do inside before you go to your car. So don't go out in your car and sit in your you know, in the driver's seat finishing your paperwork. Just do it inside the apartment of your patient, and then go out. Carry personal alarms and noise makers like whistles. Carry a minimal amount of cash. Always carry ID. Make sure your cell phone battery is charged before visits. Obviously, stay in your cars. Again, that's one of your safe spaces. Contact your manager if you notice anything threatening. Obviously, surely no one's getting out if they hear gunshots. But you know, you may be sound fighting or shouting in the apartments that you're going to, or in the apartment complex. You may want to stay in your car, call the patient. They may have a loved one who lives with them, or other caregiver who's around, who may be able to come and get you and escort you in. Just do anything that makes sense. Don't expose yourself. That's obviously the main goal of most of these tips. Notify your employer if you observe an unsecured weapon in your client's home. Use basic safety precautions, such as verbally expressed. So watch for signals of, just look at the patient, the people you're dealing with, the people around them, people outside the apartment, and just kind of be alert. Now, if you see things like, you know, sometimes you're in someone's home, obviously, so lots of times you'll see in the South in Texas, you'll see guns in someone's home. What you're worried about here, obviously, is more of a threatening kind of posture. If they've got guns on the table in the living room, that's not normal storage of firearms. If they've got them in a gun case in the living room, it may not be as big of a deal. Just use your common sense. And I would say, like, you know, if obviously it's legal to have guns, right, and it's their home, so what can you do if this kind of situation pops up? I've dealt with it before, and we didn't, with this exact issue, we didn't know exactly how to handle it, and ultimately we just talked to the patient's wife, and just explained that, look, our employees don't feel comfortable with the way they're keeping their guns. So all they did in the end was move the weapons. Usually, I would think, you know, if you give people enough time to think about it, and you're not, I guess, too aggressive with how you request, most people would, you know, if they want the care, they'll provide a safe environment for you to render the care, and that's the basics of it. I mean, if they won't take that step to make your people feel comfortable, find a new patient, refer them to another agency. Let's go to the next slide. So more tips. Maintain behavior that helps to diffuse anger by acknowledging a person's feelings, presenting a calm, caring attitude. Don't escalate or try to match threats. Ask questions and make suggestions. Do not give orders. I've also tell people don't argue or really take up for yourself. So if they're bashing your agency for not being caring and not taking care of them, sometimes it can be useful to, especially if you feel threatened, agree with them. Become their advocate. Tell them you're going to help them iron this out and make it right. That way, they don't look at you as one of the bad guys as quite as much. So, and they may see you as an ally. It doesn't matter if you're worried and scared. It does not matter if you lie to them when you do that. I mean, you could have no intention of helping them out, but you just need to get out of that environment. Obviously, don't get caught lying to patients all the time, but don't hesitate to make up some excuse for ending your visit early, or if they're griping about your agency, tell them you understand what they're saying. I'll look into that for you. We'll try to get that taken care of and get this fixed. Even if you know it can't be fixed, if they're yelling at you, there's no need to yell back. So avoid behaviors that are interpreted as aggressive, moving suddenly, moving up, invading someone's personal space, grabbing, pushing people, obviously. Just trust your judgment. Avoid any situation that doesn't feel right. and you only have one chance at surviving a bad outcome, a bad situation. So, it's best to just leave if you think that might be the kind of situation you're dealing with, some kind of threatening or violent situation. If they don't stop, if you're being verbally abused, just ask them to stop, but leave if they don't. Shorten visit again. Make something up if you have to. Tell them your equipment's malfunctioning. Tell them you got to. I could see someone even leaving something in someone's house if they need to, and just claim that they're going out to the car to get something, and then just leave. Just if you think you're in a dangerous situation, extract yourself in any way you can. If you need help, call 911 or your employer. I could see someone checking in front of a patient, not to say that they're feeling threatened, but just to show that you're communicating with others and that others know where you are without you having to tell them, everyone knows where I am, so don't do anything to me. If you observe a crime, contact the police. Probably don't do it right in front of the people committing the crime, but use your judgment there as well. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so what to do if violence appears imminent? Remain calm. If perpetrator is yelling at you or using abusive language, remain calm, speak in a measured tone. Remain respectful. So even if they're upset and you're using hostile language, just remain respectful. And what I try to tell our employees about this sort of thing is that nobody's paying you to defend yourself or the company in these situations, right? So if they're complaining about anything, home health in general or your agency, and they're upset, you don't have to win that argument right then. Just don't engage in it. Agree with it if you have to, but just remain respectful and don't be threatening in any way yourself. Don't respond to threats. Listen attentively. Try to avoid arguing or making statements that will further anger them. So this is again where lots of times I'll tell people just try to side with them at the time. So tell them you'll help them with that. Become their advocate essentially. And this is not telling you to be disingenuous to your patients. So I wouldn't do that routinely. But if you think you need to get out of a situation and someone's yelling at you, that can help. Help redirect their anger away from you and onto, say, the company. Anything that gets you out safely. You can get reassigned later, or you can discharge the patient if needed. Get help. So signal coworkers or supervisors that you need help. Call security or police. Just don't try to be a hero, and just escape. It's hard to describe many more ways than that, but it's just use your judgment. If you see a situation where someone's getting out of control, do not escalate that. Do anything and everything you can, no matter how insulting they are to you personally. It doesn't matter, really. Sometimes these people are mental health patients and they don't even know what they're saying. So don't be offended by things. Just take things in stride and move on. You'll know when you're in a situation where you can talk back and forth with a patient, and it's never a situation where someone's being violent or threatening. So let's go to the next slide. Workplace violence prevention policy. So this is back from the survey again, and so 71% of home health said that they had implemented workplace violence prevention policies. 73% had done trainings. 66% claimed to have done a risk assessment of work areas. 87% require reporting of incidents. 92% claimed to have investigated reported incidents. Don't feel pressure to accept or continue to treat anyone who's a violent patient or threatening. Just get policies on the topic and follow them. It's not the end of the world. You don't have to treat every patient in the world. You don't have to bend your policies in order to fit a patient. So let's go to the next slide. So this is on off. So how many employees per employee is offering refresher training to nurses? 66% said that they were doing workplace violence awareness training. 48% were training on de-escalation techniques. 45% training on specific evasion techniques. 49% on containment measures. 57% have trainings that cover identifying characteristics associated with aggressive and violent behavior. These are catch-alls. Obviously, these aren't, 5, 6 different trainings. It's just elements of the trainings that they get. But what would be impressive from an OSHA point of view or any other third party looking at you is if you've got actual, specific trainings just for, say, your market, right? If you know that you have one bad neighborhood that you send people into and the rest are pretty nice, you want a risk assessment for that neighborhood and maybe, some training that deals with people that you're sending into that area. If you're sending people onto, I deal with a bunch of providers out in Arizona, and so they send people sometimes to the reservations, and there's outsiders aren't, I won't say not welcome, but just like anywhere, I guess, it's not wise to just walk around the reservation by yourself at night, if no one knows you. Just like it's not wise to do the same thing in New Orleans or in where I live, Monroe, Louisiana. It's just, there are dangerous situations or areas that everyone has that are more dangerous than others. Your risk assessment should cover that specific neighborhood or that specific area. Just look at it all from both how to recognize and respond to situations, but also how to, train your employees on how to, I guess, view when they're getting into a bad situation. But as far as what policies you have, if you're going to individualize, say, your risk assessments for your work areas, that's where you would mention specific neighborhoods. Don't just use a canned policy that you found online that just talks generally about dangerous areas. I mean, you know where you're sending some new employee, and if one of those areas is one of your problem areas. So you'd want to have some training or documentation of training on that employee on how to keep themselves safe when they're there. So the next slide. So here's some of the elements to include in your workplace violence prevention policies. Management commitment, employee involvement. This is number one for a reason. So management has to be committed to sticking to it. So if you've got a potential patient or referral come in and you can see that they've got a massive psychiatric issues and they've got a long history of violence, you don't need that patient. Find another one. If you can't find a way to implement safeguards that'll protect the patient and your employees, then just don't take them. Stay committed to your plan. Employee involvement. Do not shut out your employees. And let's say you have a problem patient. Someone's got to treat them, right? Let's say they're borderline, but you think you can accept the patient if you have some safeguards in place. Talk to your employee about that. The last thing you want to do is send someone out into a situation that they're uncomfortable with, because they're just going to seem uncomfortable, just like a dog can see someone who's scared, or can sense someone who's scared, but they're going to be the very first person to complain and say, I didn't want to go there. And it's not going to look good for the company if they went there and lo and behold, something bad happened. So involve your employee in planning how to deal with any dangerous situation. Especially any workarounds you create for, or any safeguards you come up with just to continue treating a patient. You need a policy statement, obviously, just your main mission. Threat assessment team, so you need to know who's going to be in charge of figuring out which neighborhoods are bad or what you should do. Your workplace risk analysis, program evaluations, training, incident response / this is active shooter policy, but documenting how you responded to things and how you should if you obviously have known risks like active shooter policies. I think these days, lots of times It's different for different kinds of organizations on what they recommend for an active shooter. Some now claim to, run is the first thing. Others still stick by the shelter in place thing. But it's all different for different settings, and yours could be different as well. I'm not sure what your agencies are like or how large the office space is, but most of your active shooter policy for the agency will be custom for that, or that area. Record keeping. Back to those examples we gave at the beginning of my section of the presentation. That's really where they got stung. Not that they didn't have failures with respect to the incidents, the stabbing and the sexual assault, but what you should take from that slide is not just that, but how OSHA looked at how they handle these kinds of allegations in general, just as an ongoing basis, unrelated to the instant situation. And so that's really where your record keeping comes in. Go to the next slide. All right, so workplace violence prevention course. There is a NOSHA course, free interactive course that highlights real-life workplace violence incidents. It's geared for healthcare professionals, so really you should take advantage of it. It's got 13 modules. They take about 15 minutes each. So this could be your, aside from your custom kind of policies and in-service trainings on those, you just, these kinds of things like this, free trainings out there can be your yearly training. But you still want to have, if you've got a particularly problematic area, you still obviously want to tell your new employees about it and what they should do to protect themselves there. So you'll have trainings for that too. But there's lots of trainings out there available for free. You don't have to create much. Some, but not much. Go to the next slide. Yikes. But if you are, if you want to, this is talking about your provider agreement. So the community service contract provider agreement, there's a section in it that states essentially that is the responsibility, it's your agency's responsibility for the behavior of staff, the subcontractors to ensure a violence-free contractual relationship. So any remarks, gestures, actions towards the agency employees, volunteer or system agency employees, volunteers, clients that may carry even an implied threat of any kind, even if in jest, can be taken seriously and may lead to corrective action, including terminating your contract. So it's not just a law thing. It's not just a prevention of lawsuits kind of liability issue or risk management issue. It's also just required by your provider agreement too. And you can, I guess, presumably, you could violate your contract without violating OSHA regs, right? And so you think that you're complying with, all the OSHA rules, and you may be, but you may not be complying with all the terms of your contract as well. And, if they've got too many home health providers and want to trim that list, you may be the one that gets trimmed. Let's go to the next slide for some changes in law. Okay, so this is House Bill 1195. It's the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Services Service Workers Act. This is not law yet, but it's instructive for what I guess Congress decided to put in it. So the House passed it, Senate hasn't, so it's not law, but they're requiring an annual staff training, which, to be honest, I wonder how many things we can have annual trainings on. Not that workplace violence isn't a great thing to do an annual training on, not that you don't have to, but my God, there's a lot of things we have to do annual trainings on these days. But here's another one. Investigate violent incidents. You have to develop violence prevention plans that include risk assessments, hazard corrections, infrastructure upgrades. So that may be locking doors, things like that. The infrastructure upgrades may not be relevant to your agency too. Maintain and retain related records for at least 5 years. Report and evaluate information as required by OSHA's, their guidelines. So some of this we've covered: management commitment, employee participation, worksite analysis, tracking, trending, hazard prevention and control, health and safety and health training, record keeping, program eval. You really want to do, again, you want a good, solid, well thought out policy, and you want to follow it and document it. And that's really the best you can do. You can't stop violence entirely, but you can control how you respond to it and how you prepare for it. So, all things being equal, let's deal with the things that we can control. And those are the things we can control. So let's go to the next slide for some Texas changes. So these are actual changes. This is Senate Bill 45. It's effective in September 2021. It expanded the definition of employer to include individuals and businesses of any size. So previously they had a limit of 15 employees. Now they've dropped that down to 9. So now you can have individual liability or sole practitioners and as well as sole proprietors of businesses. There's another one. Let's go to the next slide. This is they amended the time to report sexual harassment incidents to the Texas Workforce Commission. It went from 180 days to 300 days. That was also effective September 1, 2021. The revised Texas Labor Code calls for liability if there's a claim of sexual harassment and the employer knows or should have known that the conduct was occurring and fails to take immediate and appropriate corrective action. So your elements are going to be, not only was there a claim of sexual harassment, and not only should you have known or know or should have known that it was occurring, but they look at how you respond. And the language they include is immediate and appropriate corrective action. Now, depending on the severity of the situation and whether or not it's creating a black eye for anyone in the press or anything, guarantee you they will have a very broad definition of appropriate. A very narrow definition of appropriate, and it may not include what you've done, especially if you're doing bare minimum. But it's one of those situations where, that's a subjective call. You want to have a lot of documentation to be able to prove that you're doing the industry standard kind of level or you're devoting an industry standard level of, attention and resources towards this issue. Otherwise, you may feel like you've done some things. You may have done some things that we have in this presentation, but it won't be considered enough unless it's substantial. So Texas doesn't define what corrective action should be taken, but administrative policy changes, training, retraining, and those are examples. But don't do the just bare minimum, and don't just find something online and adopt it wholesale without any actual interaction with employees and managers. You really want to have a custom developed deal, but it's not going to be huge. It doesn't cover every topic in the world. You don't have to cover every possible kind of violence that may be, may occur. But you do want to be thorough and have an individualized plan. Go to the next one. So COVID stuff, hopefully we're done with some of this stuff, but obviously COVID has been an issue that has resulted with COVID policies like masks and social distancing. Lots of people, lots of people don't like it, and then some of those people who don't like these policies will get a little violent or a little aggressive. I personally have had one of our therapists at our nursing home got hit by a family member because they wouldn't let them in to visit their mom who was dying. And we could have had the person arrested, and the guy just decided not to. They claimed it didn't occur to the police when they showed up. But our job as an organization was to call the police anyway. It's up to him if he's going to claim that it didn't happen. But COVID, obviously, it's created a lot of stressors. And on the next slide, there's some tips for how to reduce some of the stresses that can come from COVID. I think these are still good to keep in presentations like this, even after we're done with all policies related to COVID, because we might have these things pop up again related to something else. And, because everyone's gotten experience with COVID and feels some kind of way about COVID policies in general, if we come up with something that's not COVID, but is similar in the future because some other virus starts going around, they'll probably react the same way. So it's still, even though we're kind of winding down some of the precautionary measures that we're required to put in place for COVID, it's still a good thing to have because, there's still organizations that, I know with fertility care and with certain kind of surgery centers, they're still doing all these things with masks. They're more relaxed than they used to be, but it's still there. But this is kind of more for the future. or I'm hoping, fingers crossed, knock on wood, it's more for the future than it is for COVID. It does seem to be winding down some. The do's and don'ts is in the last slide. Let's go ahead. And so do's and don'ts. We always have these at the back. So do attend all employer-provided trainings on how to recognize and avoid and respond to potentially violent situations. Do report perceived threats or acts of violence to your manager or supervisor. Do remain aware of and support coworkers and customers if there's a threatening or violent situation. Sometimes violence is against your patient. And, it may be an abusive family member. You may not be able to raise that there, but, your job is to protect them too. So, report those things. Don't just overlook it and roll your eyes or look the other way. Sometimes it's the person you're dealing with is the victim of someone else. So just be aware of that. Don't argue with customers if they make threats or become violent. If necessary, go to a safe space. Don't try to force anyone who appears upset or violent to follow COVID prevention policies. Something I always tell everyone: don't ever let policy get in the way of proper patient care. So do not harm a patient because of a policy, and also don't let a policy get in the way of safety. So if your rule says that you could take this patient, but you feel real uncertain about it and are worried about this patient, just move on. You don't have to take everybody, and you don't have to put yourself out there. So if someone is really worried about the situation, or management is, even if your policy might allow you to continue going there or whatever, you can just not do that. That's your choice. So, and I think that's the end of our slides.
Yeah, Richard and Les, we do have one question from Juliet. She is wondering if you guys have any suggestions for night staff at hospices.
At hospices?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess it would be similar to home health, right? Lots of people don't have the ability to have an escort, right? And I'm guessing that's where the questioner's their situation is, because they'd like to have that's the solution they're looking for, but they don't have, right? So obviously, if you have an escort, there's your solution. Otherwise, I can't remember the name of it, but there are some apps out there that are there for tracking employees' whereabouts, and they don't really collect PHI or anything like that. So it's something you could easily have on there. It may be for like tracking workers' driving mileage or something similar. Those kinds of things could be helpful. And just checking. I'd say just checking in before the visit and after the visit would be one of the better things you can do. You can scout things out during the day as well. And then if it is a particularly dangerous situation, or they've got rowdy neighbors or rowdy family members, you can just do those during the day for that one patient.
Mm.
But I think maybe scouting things out during the day might be a valid option, some kind of a tracking app on people's phones. Ultimately, there's always going to be risk of walking into an apartment.
Yeah.
The thing I'm thinking is usually the other thing that comes up is lighting. Big problem with going into dark areas or going through dark areas that people get really worried about. And again, you're back to either an escort situation, or use that flashlight on your phone to try to help check it out before you enter the area. If you can't get any escorts, and then there's, of course, if you're having to park further away, then maybe it's a situation where I don't know if it's a facility, sometimes there's golf carts or something like that around. If it's just on the street, I'm not sure what you could do if you have to park along the way and then way into it. The best thing I could say would be like Les was talking about, is see if you can convince your employer to send more than one person, even if it's just an aide. Just two of you stand a better chance than one.
Maybe a family member who's reliable can meet you at their mother's apartment for therapy if it's really dangerous. They may have a big strapping young man that's their son, who can protect anybody. and is a great guy. You know, it would be. I think it'd be individual to that particular situation. That's why I say you need an individualized risk assessment, because your agency has its own unique risks. They're not the same everywhere, like this presentation talks. You know, it would be more specific for your agency.
Alrighty. Well, that was our only question for today. So that concludes today's webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our presenters, Richard and Les. Everyone from today's webinar will receive copies of the presentation slides via email. And if you have any questions about today's discussion or another healthcare law issue, please feel free to reach out to Lyles Parker or both Richard and Les's phone numbers on the screen.